Welcome to episode 151 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. This episode is dedicated to Antonio, my dear friend and whom I know has been patiently waiting for this story. It's March 31st, 1963. We're in Cochabamba at Estadio Felix Capriles. And today's story is about the only time Bolivia stood on top of South America. Because on this day in 1963, Bolivia beat Brazil 5-4 to win the South American Championship, still the only major title in the history of Verde, and still one of the great shocks the continent has ever produced. This is a story about football and geography, about a country that came late to the international game, about a football culture that lived for decades in the shadows of its neighbors, and about one tournament in which mountains, lungs, nerve, and timing all lined up at once. But how did we get here? Bolivian football begins, like so much football in South America, with British influence, not in the glamour capitals first, but through the hard infrastructure of modernity, railways, mining towns, commerce, and the movement of people. English railway workers helped carry the game inland, and by the end of the 19th century, football had taken root in places like Oruro, a city of rail, dust, altitude, and labor. From there, the game spread through urban associations, schoolyards, civic clubs, and local competition. And that matters because Bolivia didn't enter the football story at the same time as the Rio de la Plata powers. Argentina and Uruguay were already old football civilizations by the time Bolivia was still trying to build its basic structure. Chile had earlier institutional roots too. Brazil's scale and football energy were already obvious. But Bolivia, by contrast, was later to organize, later to internationalize, and for a long time less integrated nationally than its neighbors. So the builders matter here. The local associations came first. La Paz had its championship from 1914. Then in Cochabamba, on September 12, 1925, the Bolivian Football Federation was founded. Its first president was Aniceto Solares Llano. Among the early organizers were men like Luis Castel Quiroga and Felix Capriles, names that still echo in Bolivian football history. In 1926, Bolivia affiliated with FIFA and CONMEBOL. And later that same year, in Santiago, Bolivia made its international debut in the South American Championship. That debut tells you a lot. Bolivia even scored first against Chile, but then lost 7-1. And that was the pattern for a long time. Moments of spirit, followed by the reminder that this was a nation entering a competition other countries had already been shaping for decades. And there was another structural problem. For decades, Bolivian football was not really one national league in the modern sense. It was a collection of regional football worlds. La Paz mattered enormously. Cochabamba mattered. Oruro mattered. Santa Cruz would matter more and more later. But the country's football life remained fragmented. And even by the 1960s, Bolivia still didn't have the kind of nationwide professional league architecture that its bigger neighbors were building more coherently. That helps explain why Bolivia could produce passion, players, and famous local rivalries, yet still remain peripheral in the larger South American hierarchy. Then comes the geography, because no Bolivian football story is complete without the Andes. La Paz, home to the Arrandosiles, where part of this tournament was played, sits at roughly 3,600 meters above sea level, or almost 12,000 feet. Cochabamba, lower but still high, is around 2,600 meters, or 8,500 feet. That is not a romantic detail. That is sporting reality. The air is thinner, recovery is slower, visiting legs go heavy, the ball travels differently, and what feels like a normal run at sea level can feel like a debt collection at altitude. South America knew that long before the science was formalized, the altitude argument didn't begin in the 2000s. It was already there in 1963, and we already talked about this in episode 140. Uruguay, the defending champions, withdrew from this championship when matches in La Paz remained part of the plan. Chile were absent too, though for political reasons tied to the Lauca River dispute. So before the tournament had even begun, it had already been shaped by geography, politics, and refusal. And yet, altitude alone doesn't win a title. You still need players, you still need nerve. And in 1963, Bolivia had a team that could actually make the conditions count. That was Victor Agustin Ugarte, the great technician, the national idol, the player most closely associated with Bolivian footballing artistry in that era. There was Wilfredo Camacho. There was Maximo Alcocer. There was Ausberto Garcia. And there was Ramiro Blacut, who gave the side modern edge and would end this tournament recognized as its outstanding individual. This was not a random collection of survivors. This was a good Bolivian team, placed in the most favorable environment it would ever get. The tournament began chaotically. Bolivia drew 4-4 with Ecuador in a match that already felt like altitude football turned up too high, open, stretched and breathless, with 4 goals in each half, and Bolivia trailing 4-2 just 5 minutes into second half, but pulling itself back from the brink and securing the draw. Then they beat a hapless Colombia 2-1, then Peru 3-2, then Paraguay 2-0, and then Argentina 3-2. And pause there. That sequence matters, because by the time we reach March 31st, Bolivia have now stumbled into contention. They have beaten 4 serious opponents in a row. They have scored freely. They have conceded too many. But they have kept winning. And now the final day arrives. Paraguay, the only team that can still catch them, draw 1-1 with Argentina. That means Bolivia know exactly what is required. Avoid defeat against Brazil, and the title is theirs. Lose, and the championship is thrown into a playoff. The opponent is Brazil. Not exactly the full image of Chile 1962, no. But still Brazil. Still the shirt. Still the aura of the reigning world champions. Still enough prestige that if Bolivia is going to do this, they will do it against the heaviest name possible. So we arrive at the afternoon itself. Brazil score first, and for a moment the old hierarchy seems to be reasserting itself. This is Bolivia, after all. This is how these stories usually end. The brave host, the noise, the dream, and then the correction. But no, Bolivia answer. Victor Ugarte makes it 1-1. Then Flavio scores his second for Brazil. Yet Wilfredo Camacho equalizes for Bolivia before halftime. Immediately after the break, Ausberto Garcia puts La Verde 3-2 ahead, and now the stadium begins to believe for real. Maximo Alcocer makes it 4-2 at the hour mark, and then, with 20 minutes left, Bolivia gets a penalty, and Victor Ugarte steps up, converts, and now the hosts are up 5-2. Brazil heads back a few minutes later. Marco Antonio scores, and now Brazil is on the chase. With 1 minute left, Antonio scores another, but that's it. Bolivia 5, Brazil 4. And then comes the moment that lives forever in Bolivian football. They are champions of South America. Just sit with that for a second. Bolivia, champions of South America, ahead of Paraguay, ahead of Argentina, ahead of Brazil, ahead of everyone. It remains one of the most extraordinary final tables in the history of the competition, and it remains Bolivia's only continental crown. So what? This was a genuine shock, not because Bolivia had no football culture, they did, and not because they had no good players, they did, but because South American football had long been ordered around older, heavier centers of power, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, and to a lesser degree Chile and Paraguay. Bolivia were not supposed to finish above all of them, not in the normal script. Also, 1963 didn't become a permanent transformation. That is one of the most important parts of the story. This triumph didn't suddenly create a Bolivian superpower. It didn't trigger a sustained domestic revolution. It didn't inaugurate a golden generation that dominated the next decade. In fact, when Bolivia returned to defend the title in 1967, they finished bottom. That tells you everything about the fragility of the 1963 peak. But why? Because structure still mattered more than one magical month. Bolivia still lacked the kind of durable integrated football ecosystem that reproduces success. Regionalism remained strong. National league development lagged, and the wider South American hierarchy reasserted itself. But then, and this is the longer arc that matters, a second rise began, not in 63, but later. In 78 in Santa Cruz, the Academia Tahuichi Aguilera opened its doors, and that changed the developmental story of Bolivian football. This was not just another academy. It became a pipeline, a school of repetition, identity, and continuity. Marco Echeverri, Erwin Sanchez, Luis Cristaldo, Jaime Moreno. A whole generation either came through Tahuichi or was shaped by the football world it helped create. Then, in 1986, Bolivia's under-16 side won the South American title. That result didn't get the continental mythology of 63, but in developmental terms, it may have mattered even more. It was evidence that Bolivia were no longer waiting for a miracle. They were producing. By 1993, under Xavier Azcagorta, and with a squad heavily marked by Tahuichi, Bolivia beat Brazil 2-0 in La Paz, the first time Brazil had ever lost a World Cup qualifier. That team reached USA in 1994, and in 1997, Bolivia hosted the Copa America again and reached the final, losing 3-1 to Brazil. That was the second great Bolivian summit. Not a miracle month this time, but the visible reward of a longer build. But then a drop came again. The golden generation aged, the momentum stalled. By the 21st century, the federation itself would openly speak of deterioration and mismanagement inside Bolivian football. So the larger lesson of Bolivia's football history is not just that altitude helps. It's that altitude amplifies what is already there. If the system is strong, altitude becomes a weapon. If the system is weak, altitude becomes a story people tell about what might have been. And that is what makes the present moment interesting. Because now, on the day this episode goes out, March 31st, 2026, Bolivia face Iraq in the World Cup playoff tournament final in Guadalupe, Mexico. And once again, the country is trying to turn a difficult football identity into a breakthrough. The current rebuild is not accidental. There's fresh youth work. There's FIFA development support. There's a younger generation coming through. And there's new infrastructure. There's also the unmistakable old Bolivian instinct to use environmental intelligently, even recently by taking home qualifiers up to El Alto, higher still than La Paz. So maybe that is the truest legacy of 1963. Not that Bolivia became a permanent power. They didn't. But that they proved something they have spent the next 6 decades trying to prove again. That under the right condition, with the right generation, Bolivia can still bend the hierarchy. So before we go, 3 things to take away from March 31st, 1963. First, Bolivia's title was not a fluke in the narrow sense. It was a real tournament win by a team that beat Colombia, Peru, Paraguay, Argentina, and then Brazil. The shock is real, but so is the football. Second, altitude matters, but structure matters more. The mountains helped in 1963. They helped again in the 90s. But the bigger rise came when Bolivia paired geography with development. And third, football peaks do not sustain themselves. 1963 glowed, then faded. The Tahuichi generation rose, then faded. Which means the Bolivian story is not one miracle. It's a cycle of ascent, decline, and attempted renewal. On this day in 1963, Bolivia beat Brazil 5-4 in Cochabamba and won the South American Championship, the only time Verde had stood on top of the continent, and one of the rare days when South American football's natural order seemed to tilt toward the mountains. That's all for episode 151 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Lost Guy. If you, like Antonio, enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a 5-star rating, and share it with all your friends. Tomorrow, we go to Lisbon and to April 1st, 1928, when Argentina played their first ever international outside South America against Portugal on the road to the Olympic Games. See you tomorrow.